Behind every British screen legend was a family, and sometimes a trail of emotional wreckage. They made us laugh, cry, and believe in larger-than-life charm. But off-screen, some of these stars were staging a different kind of drama, as distant, volatile, or dangerously controlling parents. In this video, we're peeling back the curtain on 11 of Britain's most celebrated performers, and the children who lived in their shadows. These aren't just cautionary tales. They're unresolved mysteries of legacy, damage, and the dark cost of brilliance. Because what if the role they played best was the one the public never saw? Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed for more stories that peel back the polished surface and dig into the unsettling truths underneath. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Midnight in Manchester? 3 a.m. in Toronto? We want to know who's out there, wandering through the dark with us. 1. Peter Sellers. Peter Sellers was many things. A national treasure, a shape-shifting comic genius, a man who could disappear into characters with terrifying ease. And if you ask his son, a monster with a belt. The public remembers him as the brilliant man behind the Pink Panther, Dr. Strangelove, and The Goon Show, a chaos god of mid-century comedy. But off-screen, his chaos didn't turn off. It simply redirected to the nearest living target. And more often than not, that was his own children. Michael Sellers, Peter's son, spent much of his adult life trying to make sense of the father-shaped crater in his past. In his memoirs, frequently cited in obituaries and retrospectives, he paints a picture that's harder to laugh at, a household ruled by fear, where creative brilliance and cruelty went hand in hand. The most infamous moment, a young Michael paints a bit of his father's car, trying to impress him. Peter responds by beating him with a belt. You can almost hear the applause track cutting out. There are layers here, dangerously thin ones. Because while many fathers of the era doled out physical punishment and called it discipline, Sellers brought a different kind of volatility to the role. He didn't just explode, he vanished. He threatened disownment. He played emotional Russian roulette with his children's affections, withdrawing, returning, then vanishing again, like a particularly moody magician. In interviews and biographies, family members describe him as someone who could be painfully charming one day and unreachably distant the next. The disowning wasn't metaphorical either. Sellers would at times speak as if his own children were no longer his, brushing them off like poor reviews. This wasn't just parental neglect. It was weaponized absence. A father who used silence the way other people use arguments, sharply, strategically, and without warning. The British press has grown bolder in its later assessments. No longer content to call him temperamental, they've started telling it straight. Sellers was a genius with a destructively unstable personality. A man whose inner life was so chaotic, so allergic to constancy, that nothing, including his children, could count on him. But here's the real kicker. Even as his children lived in this maelstrom of unpredictability, Sellers played doting fathers on screen. He was lovable, clumsy, misunderstood. He was funny. And maybe that's the most chilling contradiction of all, watching a man act like the father he never was. Of course, if you ask the biographers, they'll say he couldn't help it. He was tormented, pressured, misunderstood. But it's always fascinating how the misunderstood ones manage to find clarity when it's time to deliver a punchline. Or a slap. And with that belt still echoing across the decades, let's shift our attention to someone whose name comes up far less often in polite company. Not because his story is less cruel, but because it's darker, harder to verify, and frankly harder to say out loud. 2. Arthur Mullard. For many years, Arthur Mullard was known as a Cockney character actor with a face made for punchlines. He popped up in sitcoms, made people laugh in pubs, and died in 1995 with an obituary that described him as a lovable rogue. That obituary hasn't aged well, because not long after his death, another story surfaced. One that would never have made it into a cheery Radio Times listing. One that rewrote everything. The allegations came from his daughter, Barbara. According to her, Mullard was not a lovable rogue, but a man who beat his wife, terrified his children, and, most disturbingly, sexually abused her starting in early adolescence. The timeline, as she described it, began when she was around 13. It lasted for years. These allegations were made after his death, and like many posthumous accusations, they were met with immediate discomfort, dispute, and a lot of shaken heads. Some within the family denied them outright. Others stayed quiet, and the press, caught off guard, wasn't sure what to do with the story. Because what do you do with a man who made his name on laughter and whose legacy now hinges on silence? It's crucial to note that these allegations remain officially unproven. No court ever found him guilty. But then again, courts don't often prosecute the dead. And for many observers, the consistency of Barbara's claims, the detail, the timing, the emotional weight suggests something much harder to dismiss. Context matters too. Post-war Britain wasn't known for its sympathy to victims of domestic abuse, let alone incest. Families were fortresses, shame was a moat, and public men were protected with an almost religious reverence. If a girl spoke up, she was ignored. If a mother tried to flee, she was blamed. So when Barbara finally told her story decades later, it wasn't just a cry for justice. It was a rupture in the national nostalgia. Biographers and historians now treat Mullard as a deeply contested figure. Some simply omit the allegations. Others mention them with a footnote's worth of caution. But every year, more writers are beginning to acknowledge that the gap between public charm and private cruelty is not rare. It's the norm. And maybe that's the thread that binds these stories together. Not the shock, but the repetition. The unsettling realization that so many British stars built careers on playing themselves. And we didn't think to ask what that actually meant. So what happens when the performance ends? When the smile fades, the camera's cut, and the father comes home? Well, if you're Peter O'Toole's daughter, what happens next is a drunken prank you never forget, and a childhood that walked the tightrope between myth and menace. If you've made it this far, you're clearly not here for the sanitized version of history, so why not stick around? Hit subscribe to keep these stories coming, and while the next mystery loads, tell us in the comments, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you right now? Are you watching this with morning coffee, or at 2 a.m. when the ghosts get loud? 3. Peter O'Toole. Peter O'Toole had the kind of face that made you want to listen, even when he was lying, especially when he was lying. His voice, that baritone lull with a grin baked in, could get away with anything, from blasphemy to bedtime stories. On screen, he was magnetic. Off screen, he was unpredictable. And at home, he was a riddle wrapped in whiskey and set on fire. To the public, he was Laurence of Arabia, the lion in winter, a charming madman with a death wish and a wit so sharp it practically whistled through the air. But to his daughters, particularly Kate, who has spoken about him with a mix of fondness and flinching, he was something else entirely. A man too wild to parent, too drunk to protect, and too famous to truly reach. The legend of Peter O'Toole often veers toward the mythic, the last of the Hellraisers. Drinking contests with Burton and Harris, smoking on set, laughing through arrests. But behind those myths were children trying to make sense of a man who could vanish into a bottle just as easily as he could vanish into a roll. One of the most chilling stories doesn't involve shouting or violence. It involves a joke, a prank, the kind of just having a laugh incident that reveals something deeper, because it wasn't funny to the child it happened to. According to an interview with Kate O'Toole, her father once pretended, while inebriated, to brand or tattoo her with a hot object as a joke. She was a teenager. It was meant to be hilarious. He thought so. She did not. That moment has stayed with her. not because it was the worst thing that happened, but because it encapsulated everything. The absurdity, the humiliation, the power imbalance dressed up as charm. Stories like that tend to get passed over in biographies. They're too strange to summarize and too ambiguous to prosecute, but they speak volumes. They show us what happens when charisma becomes a cover, when the world keeps clapping, even as the kids flinch. There's no doubt that O'Toole loved his children. He said it often. But love, as his life makes clear, is not the same thing as safety, or presence, or even awareness. His home life, especially during his peak fame, was a rotating cast of parties, arguments, and hangovers. And in that atmosphere, the emotional needs of two young daughters became background noise. The public ate it up. Because hell-raising is entertaining, as long as you're not the one being raised in it. And in Britain's mid-century acting circles, the more chaotic the father, the more legendary the man. Sobriety was boring. Restraint was cowardice. Real men drank until the furniture apologized. Today, Kate O'Toole speaks with nuance. She doesn't condemn him outright. She acknowledges the complexity, the contradictions. But it's hard to ignore the thread that runs through every story, a deep sense of instability, the feeling that home was not a refuge, but a place where performance never stopped. And performance is a poor substitute for parenting. Still, if O'Toole was a hurricane, then his former wife, Siân Phillips, was the calm eye, or so it appeared. But step closer, and that calm reveals its own kind of chill, the kind that doesn't scream or rage, just looks straight through you like you were never there at all. 4. Siân Phillips. Siân Phillips had the kind of voice that could freeze a room without raising in volume. On stage, she was magnetic. On screen, mesmerizing. In I, Claudius, she played Livia, the icy Roman matriarch whose words carried the weight of poison. Off-screen, according to her daughter, she was no less severe, just subtler. To the public, Phillips was a pillar of poise and classical discipline, the Welsh-born actress with a spine made of Shakespeare. But behind the regal bearing and celebrated career, there are accounts, particularly from her daughter Kate, that speak of something colder. Not dramatic abuse, not chaos or drunkenness, something quieter, more difficult to name, and maybe, for that reason, even harder to forget. Emotional distance, estrangement. A mother who, in her own daughter's words, was never nice to her. In interviews, Kate O'Toole has described a childhood marked by a strange absence. Not physical, Phillips was there, but present in a way that felt like surveillance, not warmth. There were no beatings, no broken plates, just a sustained, exhausting undercurrent of disapproval. It was, as she tells it, like growing up in a museum, surrounded by performance, discipline, and legacy, but rarely affection. And when the marriage between Siân Phillips and Peter O'Toole disintegrated, the emotional temperature didn't rise, it dropped. The household became a battleground of silence and detachment. One parent, unpredictable and wild, the other precise, composed, and uninterested in consolation. To some, this might sound like restraint, dignity. But to a child, it can feel like erasure, like existing in a house where love is conditional and affection is awarded like a trophy, rarely and with ceremony. Phillips herself has spoken about her marriage, her career, and the sacrifices required of women in her position. She has described the conflict, the compromises, the ways she had to harden to survive in a male-dominated industry. And perhaps that hardness became habit. Perhaps, in refusing to be undone by her circumstances, she became emotionally unavailable to those who needed softness most. This isn't a story of clear villainy. That's what makes it so unsettling. It's not easy to point to a single moment of cruelty. Instead, the harm lies in the texture of a childhood spent seeking warmth in a house built of marble. Critics and historians now approach Phillips with a more reflective lens. They see in her a case study of how a parent doesn't need to scream to scar. That emotional austerity, especially when paired with public acclaim, can feel to a child like growing up in the shadow of a statue. And yet, her story sits in contrast with the volcanic temperament of O'Toole. Together, they created a domestic paradox. Too much chaos from one side, too much cold from the other. The result? Daughters who learned early on that safety doesn't always live in fame and that applause doesn't mean affection. If Siân Phillips was the stone pillar of her household, then Rex Harrison, up next, was something far more brittle, a man who built his persona on charm but left behind a trail of children who felt invisible. 5. Rex Harrison. Rex Harrison never liked to be questioned. He preferred scripts, controlled, elegant, and written with him in mind. He liked being the center of the scene, the cleverest man in the room, and in his films, that's what he was. Polished, witty, impeccably British. The Professor Higgins who transformed a flower girl with sheer force of will. At home, however, there were no scripts, just children. And children don't take direction well. To the world, Harrison was charming, sharp-tongued, the quintessential English gentleman with a dash of acid. But to those inside his circle, especially his sons, he was something else entirely, distant, cold, and emotionally untouchable. No yelling, no breaking things, no scenes. Just a steady, smirking detachment that could make even affection feel like a contractual misunderstanding. He had 2 sons, Noel and Carrie, both of whom pursued lives under the weight of his name. And what echoes most in the stories that have survived isn't scandal or betrayal, but the strange flatness of his parenting. According to various accounts, Rex wasn't so much cruel as he was uninterested. He didn't scream at his children, he dismissed them. He didn't oppose their careers, he ignored them. And when they performed, he often declined to attend, or offered cutting remarks that landed like darts wrapped in silk. There's one anecdote now passed around as part of Harrison's legend, where a son invited him to a performance. Rex's response? A dry, withering joke about how watching amateurs was bad for his eyesight. That's the kind of love he handed out, clever enough to quote, cold enough to regret. Biographers often tread lightly when it comes to Harrison's family life. There are no court records, no memoir confessions, just the sense, passed down in interviews and recollections, that being his child was like orbiting a star that never looked back. Some describe him as reserved, others as acerbic. None use the word warm, and that's part of the story. Because British masculinity, especially in Harrison's era, prized a certain kind of performance. The emotionally restrained father, the razor-witted cynic, the man whose love, if you ever found it, was buried beneath layers of irony and polished apathy. In a way, Harrison embodied this ideal perfectly, on stage and off. He was beloved by audiences for being precise, sophisticated, and occasionally cruel in a charming sort of way. But when that charm became the only note he knew how to play, his family learned to hear it as a kind of silence. Today, retrospectives on Harrison tend to frame him as a man who lived for the stage and tolerated the rest. A performer who brought elegance to every role and frost to every family dinner. He wasn't a monster. He was something trickier. A man so convinced of his own brilliance that he forgot to be human. And if Harrison offered only indifference, the next figure on this list offered something even colder, absence. Because some fathers don't yell, they simply leave. And Laurence Olivier left more than once. 6. Laurence Olivier. Laurence Olivier was born to play gods and kings. His face belonged on statues, his voice in cathedrals. He brought Shakespeare to life with thunder and lightning in his bones. To Britain, he was the national actor. To Hollywood, he was elegance incarnate. But to his first son, Tarquin, he was mostly not there. The story of Olivier's parenting isn't one of flamboyant cruelty or scandalous headlines. It's the quieter tragedy of being forgotten, or more precisely, being written out of the script entirely. Tarquin Olivier has spoken openly about what it was like to grow up in the shadow of a man who played Hamlet to the world, but couldn't find time to say goodnight. Olivier's first marriage, to actress Jill Esmond, produced a son, and then drifted into the rear-view mirror of his career. Tarquin was still a child when Olivier's love life, and life in general, took a sharp turn toward Vivien Leigh and international stardom. From that point on, the household split became permanent, and Tarquin found himself pushed to the side of his father's narrative. He wasn't rejected, just deprioritized. Accounts from Tarquin, echoed in press interviews and his own writings, describe a childhood of longing. Visits were rare, often stilted. When they did occur, they were formal, awkward, and clouded by the presence of whoever Olivier was currently partnered with. He wasn't hostile. He was remote, courteous, sometimes even kind, but always at a distance. This kind of neglect doesn't come with bruises. It comes with questions. Questions about whether you were ever really seen, whether your father's love was reserved for audiences, or just rationed so thinly that none was left for you. Olivier's defenders often point out the context, the relentless touring, the pressure of maintaining a transatlantic career, the demands of genius. But that defense wears thin when it becomes a pattern. When your own child says you were essentially a ghost, a famous one, a beautiful one, but a ghost nonetheless. Later in life, Olivier tried to mend things. There were letters, reunions, photographs of grandfatherly affection. But those don't erase the decades where his son watched him from a distance, on screen, on stage, on the arms of new women, and wondered what role, if any, he played in that grand performance. What makes Olivier's story particularly haunting is that he wasn't a villain. He was the embodiment of grace, talent, and restraint. But those very traits, which thrilled millions, built a wall between him and the people closest to him. He was adored by strangers, and unknown by his own son. As the camera pulls back from Olivier's legacy, it reveals a man who conquered the world but struggled with the ordinary. He could move an audience to tears with a soliloquy, but struggled to say, "I'm proud of you," without cue cards. And if Olivier's parenting felt like a vanishing act, Vivien Leigh, his once wife, and next on this list, left a very different mark. Not through absence, but through intensity. Her story is one of brilliance shadowed by breakdown, and of a daughter who watched as the performance of motherhood blurred into something much harder to name. 7. Vivien Leigh. Vivien Leigh was born to play tragic women. She made pain look beautiful, madness look elegant, heartbreak look operatic. Her face, immortalized in Gone with the Wind and A Streetcar Named Desire, became the iconography of suffering, framed in soft lighting and eyeliner. But off-screen, the line between performance and reality blurred, and the suffering didn't stop when the cameras did. To the world, Leigh was dazzling. Difficult, yes, but dazzling. A woman whose artistry outshone her instability, until eventually, it didn't. But to her daughter, Suzanne, she was something much harder to define. A mother frequently absent, sometimes present, but rarely predictable. And in the spaces between those appearances, between one whirlwind romance and the next production, was a child left to make sense of a life always on the brink. The stories that survive about Leigh's parenting are more fragmented than most. She didn't write memoirs explaining herself. Her daughter rarely gives interviews. Much of what we know comes through biographies, interviews with contemporaries, and the general smoke that hangs around a house long after the fire's gone out. And the smoke smells like chaos. Biographers describe her as someone pulled in a dozen directions, by fame, by love affairs, by illness. Her bipolar disorder, untreated for much of her life, cast a long shadow. There were episodes, disappearances, intense mood swings, passionate gestures that could shift into silence without explanation. And in the middle of that, a young girl, Suzanne, trying to find safety in a household ruled by theatrical logic, not emotional stability. There's a cruel irony in Leigh's story. She played some of the most iconic mothers and wives on stage and screen, delivering performances that moved people to tears. And yet, at home, she struggled to connect in the roles that weren't scripted. As a wife, she was adored and feared. As a mother, she was, in the kindest phrasing, unreliable. But we have to be careful here, because mental illness isn't cruelty. It isn't malice. It isn't something you choose. Leigh's breakdowns weren't performances. They were symptoms. And yet the impact on a child is real, regardless of the cause. Suzanne wasn't raised by a monster. She was raised by someone who, at times, wasn't fully there. And when she was, she could be engulfing, demanding, emotional, unpredictable, in a way that left little room for a child's needs. Those who knew Leigh often describe her as both deeply loving and emotionally dangerous. Not in a violent sense, but in the way that every good day felt like a promise, and every bad day a betrayal. In that environment, attachment becomes a gamble. Children grow up learning to read the weather in their parents' face before they learn to trust it. In recent years, the conversation around Leigh has shifted. She is no longer just the tragic heroine, but a woman caught in a brutal time for mental health, when treatment was crude and stigma was thick. We now understand more about what she went through, but understanding doesn't erase the past. It only reframes it. So Leigh's legacy is complicated. She gave the world beauty and devastation. But her daughter? She got both, without the applause. And as Suzanne tried to find her footing in a world shaped by instability, another daughter, Kate Burton, was learning something similar. Because when your father is Richard Burton, every room feels a little too loud, and love is always half drunk. 8. Richard Burton. Richard Burton had a voice that could shake the walls of a theater. Deep, rich, and soaked in Shakespeare. He made kings sound relatable and sinners sound like poets. Offstage, he lived like he acted, grandly, chaotically, and often dangerously. He drank, he argued, he fell in love like it was a sport. And somewhere in all that spectacle was his daughter, Kate, watching from the wings. To the world, Burton was magnetic, a force, a tempest in a tuxedo. But to his family, he was a man divided, between countries, between wives, between bottles. And in the gaps he left behind, his children tried to piece together an image of a father who was constantly in motion. Kate Burton has spoken with a quiet clarity about her father. She doesn't paint him as a villain, but she doesn't varnish the truth either. She describes a man who was often absent, occasionally present, and almost always wrestling with himself. He could be kind. He could be distant. He was many things, some of them contradictory, all of them exhausting. The most visible rupture came with Elizabeth Taylor. When Burton and Taylor began their high-octane affair, two galaxies colliding in front of the paparazzi, it was more than a love story. It was a media event. And as that romance exploded across front pages, the quieter fallout landed at home. Kate's mother never spoke to Burton again. The family split, and Kate's life was suddenly divided between continents, households, and mythologies. Burton didn't vanish, not entirely. There were visits, gestures, attempts at connection, but they were often overshadowed by his fame, his habits, and his instability. The problem wasn't that he didn't care, it's that he couldn't always act like he did. Addiction has a way of replacing intention with impulse, and for all his eloquence, Burton was a man often ruled by his urges. Still, Kate speaks of him with a kind of reverence, a love tempered by realism. She remembers the boat trips, the quiet moments, the warmth. But those memories live alongside the messier ones. Missed chances, public meltdowns, the awkwardness of being the daughter of a legend who never quite figured out how to be a dad. Burton's defenders will point to the times he tried. And yes, there were many. But fatherhood isn't measured by intention alone. It's measured by consistency, by safety, by showing up when the cameras aren't rolling. And on that score, the reviews are mixed. What's most haunting is that Burton probably understood this. He was too intelligent not to. But brilliance, as this list keeps reminding us, rarely translates into emotional competence. He could quote poetry at will, but couldn't always find the words to comfort a child. He could command a stage, but couldn't navigate a living room without knocking something over, literally or metaphorically. In the end, Richard Burton wasn't a bad man. He was a big one, and sometimes big men take up so much space that no one else can breathe. Kate eventually found her own voice, on stage, fittingly, but before that she had to learn to live with the echoes of a father who was always a little louder than life. And speaking of echoes, our next figure, Charlie Chaplin, was perhaps the most famous silent man in the world. But in his home, silence meant something else entirely. Not art, not performance, control. 9. Charlie Chaplin. Charlie Chaplin built an empire on a bowler hat and a limp. He was the man who taught the world how to laugh without words. The little tramp was gentle, misunderstood, endlessly tender. But behind that soft-focused mythology lived a very different patriarch, one who ruled a vast, complicated household with the kind of authority that doesn't need to raise its voice to be heard. Chaplin had many children across multiple marriages. By the time his youngest were growing up, he was already a legend, rich, revered, and insulated by layers of staff, schedules, and carefully managed public image. That kind of environment doesn't naturally lend itself to ordinary parenting. It lends itself to distance. And distance, when paired with power, tends to turn into control. Biographies describe Chaplin as meticulous about his home. Not warm, organized, not affectionate, structured. Children lived inside a system that revolved around his work, his needs, his routines. Nannies, tutors, household managers did most of the day-to-day care, which left Chaplin in the role of the remote sun around which everyone else orbited. That can work when the sun is kind. It's harder when the gravity feels heavy. Accounts from those who grew up in Chaplin's house often describe a strange duality. On one hand, he could be charming, playful, even silly with his kids. On the other, he was deeply controlling, especially about image, behavior, and loyalty. His personal life had already been riddled with scandal, and as a result, he became fiercely protective of how his family appeared to the world. Children were not just children. They were part of the brand. This kind of pressure is subtle but powerful. You grow up not quite sure if you're loved for who you are or for how well you behave. You learn to perform long before you learn to relax. And when the family patriarch is one of the most famous people on the planet, the stakes of displeasing him feel unreasonably high. It's also important to tread carefully here. Many of the most damaging stories about Chaplin conflate his romantic life with his parenting. That's not the same thing. But what emerges clearly from biographies and family histories is a pattern of imbalance. An older, immensely powerful father presiding over a household filled with young children and much younger wives, where decisions flowed one way and emotional gravity did the same. Chaplin was not cruel in the loud sense. He didn't rage. He didn't threaten. He simply set the rules and expected them to be followed. In an era when powerful men were rarely questioned, that was enough. To some of his children, this structure provided stability. To others, it felt stifling. What's consistent is that Chaplin was always in charge of the story, the house, the narrative. And children who grow up in someone else's narrative often struggle to write their own. In modern reassessments of Chaplin, critics are increasingly willing to hold two ideas at once: that he was a genius and that he was a complicated, controlling patriarch. His films taught the world about empathy. His household, by contrast, was built on hierarchy. And if Chaplin's children lived in a carefully managed orbit, the next man on this list was something else entirely. A star so chaotic that even his own family couldn't quite predict which version of him would walk through the door. Oliver Reed didn't rule with control. He ruled with unpredictability. And the difference to a child can be just as unsettling. 10. Oliver Reed. Oliver Reed was a storm with a smile. To the public, he was the ultimate British wild man, boisterous, fearless, gloriously unfiltered. He drank too much, spoke too loudly, and lived like tomorrow was an optional feature. On screen, that made him electric. At home, it made him complicated. Reed's son, Mark, has spoken about growing up in the shadow of that reputation. And what he offers isn't a neat condemnation or a glossy defense. It's something messier. A portrait of a father who was both loving and exhausting, both present and gone, both affectionate and unreliable. Mark doesn't describe a household ruled by fear. He describes one ruled by inconsistency. Some days Oliver Reed was the best dad in the world, funny, engaged, overflowing with stories and warmth. Other days he was distant, distracted, lost in his own orbit. When your father is famous for his excess, you grow up expecting extremes. Reed's public persona didn't leave much room for privacy. He was constantly being written about, joked about, mythologized. That kind of attention seeps into the home. It becomes part of the air you breathe. And when that air is thick with chaos, children adapt in strange ways. Mark has said that to him, his father's behavior felt normal. That's the most revealing part. Because children normalize what they're given. They don't know another version. If your dad comes home loud and unpredictable, that becomes dad. If he disappears for stretches of time, that becomes life. Reed wasn't abusive in the traditional sense, at least not according to his son, but he was unreliable. And unreliability has its own kind of impact. It teaches you not to expect too much, not to ask for too much, not to be disappointed when plans fall apart. There's a temptation, especially in stories like Reed's, to romanticize the chaos, to turn his excess into legend. And Reed himself played into that image. He enjoyed being the rogue, the lovable disaster. But for a child, a disaster is still a disaster, even if it's charming. Modern profiles of Reed often emphasize this duality. Yes, he could be tender. Yes, he could be present. But he also lived on the edge of his own impulses. And that meant his family often had to build their lives around a moving target. In the end, Oliver Reed's parenting legacy is one of contradiction, a man capable of deep affection, but incapable of moderation, a father who loved but couldn't always show up in the ways that mattered most. And that contradiction leads us to the final figure on this list, a man whose public image was built on suave confidence and controlled masculinity, but whose private reputation as a father has been tangled in years of rumor, denial, and complicated truth. Because when your father is James Bond, even family drama comes with a license to be misunderstood. Sir Sean Connery is waiting in the wings. 11. Sir Sean Connery. Sir Sean Connery spent a lifetime playing men who never flinched. Soldiers, spies, kings, men who walked into danger with a raised eyebrow and walked out with a perfectly knotted tie. To the public, he was confidence incarnate. But to his son, Jason Connery, he was something much more complicated. A father whose shadow was long, whose expectations were heavy, and whose reputation often spoke louder than he ever did. For decades, the press has tried to turn their relationship into a melodrama. Headlines about feuds, stories about inheritance, rumors of coldness, control, or emotional distance. It all reads like a script written by tabloids that never met a quiet nuance they didn't want to punch up. And yet, like many celebrity family stories, there is a real human tension beneath the exaggeration. Jason Connery grew up mostly with his mother after Sean Connery's marriage ended. That separation alone shaped everything that followed. In the world of famous fathers, physical distance has a way of becoming emotional distance, whether anyone intends it or not. Jason was raised in a different household, in a different rhythm, watching his father become one of the most recognizable faces on earth from afar. That kind of childhood creates a strange split-screen existence. On one side, Your dad is the most admired man in the cinema. On the other, he's the person you see a few times a year in carefully scheduled visits that never quite feel natural. You don't get to experience him as a regular parent. You experience him as a guest star. Over the years, reports have floated about tension between father and son, especially around money, inheritance, and the expectations that come with the Connery name. But Jason himself has repeatedly pushed back against the harshest versions of that story. In more recent interviews, he's described a relationship that evolved with time. One that wasn't perfect, but wasn't the Cold War the tabloids loved to sell either. What makes Connery's place on this list so interesting is that he represents something different from the others. He's not here because of a single shocking story. He's here because of the space between narratives, between the public myth and the private reality, between the idea of the tough, dominant father and the actual emotional needs of a child growing up under that weight. Sean Connery was famously private. He didn't offer up his personal life for inspection. That alone created a vacuum. And where there's a vacuum, speculation rushes in. Some accounts painted him as stern, others as distant. Jason, in contrast, has often emphasized that his father supported him, even if the relationship wasn't always close in the traditional sense. And that's the uncomfortable truth about celebrity parenting. Sometimes the damage isn't dramatic enough to make headlines. Sometimes it's just a long, quiet ache. The feeling of being loved, but not quite known. Of being supported, but not always understood. Of having a famous last name that opens doors and closes conversations at the same time. Connery was a man of his generation, stoic, reserved, not given to emotional transparency. That kind of fatherhood was once seen as normal. Strong, silent, reliable. But for children growing up in the emotional economy of the modern world, that silence can feel like distance. So where does that leave Sean Connery as a parent? Somewhere between legend and reality. Not the tyrant some stories suggested, not the flawless father his admirers might hope for. Just a man who, like so many on this list, struggled to translate public power into private intimacy. And maybe that's the quietest, saddest pattern of all. Because when fame builds a fortress around you, even your own children can end up knocking at the gate, waiting to be let inside.